FA fam, welcome back in. Kev, it is somehow week 4 already. These first 3 weeks have absolutely flown by. A couple of situations to pay attention to this week. So let's not waste any time. Let's help the folks get locked in for week 4. Going to be talking about our top 24 running back rankings today. So let's dive right in. Leading things off at RB1 for us this week is none other than Saquon Barkley, followed by Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Kyren Williams, Jonathan Taylor, Alvin Kamara at 6, Jordan Mason, Derrick Henry, Aaron Jones, James Conner, Devon Achane, and Jahmyr Gibbs rounding out our top 12. Kev, who do the folks need to know about in these top 12 running backs?
Yeah, I think you have to start off with Kyren Williams. I mean, he continues to be the absolute bell cow in this backfield. He is currently handling 86% of the snaps, 78% of the rush attempts, but he has only seen a 9.8% target share despite running 67% of the routes. All of his uses has led him to average 20.4 fantasy points per game. Now, from an efficiency respect, he really hasn't been that great. He ranks 53rd out of 53 qualifying running backs in missed tackles forced per attempt. In fact, that number is 0.02 missed tackles forced per attempt. So basically, he has one. He's also 45th in yards after contact per attempt and averaging only a 3.04 yards per carry. However, his 5 touchdowns and his insane usage made him one of the best running backs through 3 games. This week, the Rams head to Chicago to take on a Bears defense that has struggled to stop the run this season. The Bears have allowed the 14th most rushing yards, the 3rd most rushing touchdowns, and the 8th most fantasy points per game to running backs. Kyren will continue to have a high floor because of the amount of touches he's seeing. Let's move over to Aaron Jones. Revenge game narrative for this week for Aaron Jones. The Packers moved on from Aaron Jones this offseason, and Aaron Jones is proving that it might have been premature to do so. He's currently handling 53% of the rush attempts and an excellent 18% target share on the year. He's also been really efficient, averaging 5.43 yards per carry, while also ranking 11th in missed tackles forced per attempt and 2nd in yards after contact per attempt. The Packers have also allowed the 11th most fantasy points per game to running backs, due in large part because they have allowed the 12th most receptions and the 5th most receiving yards, as well as a 5.0 yards per carry on the season. Aaron Jones should once again be a very solid option this week. And then let's move over to James Conner. The Cardinals and James Conner, not surprisingly, struggled last week against the Lions after back-to-back top 10 weeks. He finishes the RB53 with 4 fantasy points. This week, James Conner gets a much better matchup against the Commanders. The Commanders have allowed the 12th most rushing yards, the 13th most touchdowns, the 6th most receptions, and the 7th most receiving yards to go along for the 14th most PPR points. Since Conner isn't involved in the passing game, has to get there through the ground. This is a good matchup for him to exploit this. He's currently averaging 14.1 PPR points per game, which puts him at RB21 overall. We have Joe Mixon versus the Jaguars. Now, I'm not sure if he's going to play. He missed week 3 with an ankle injury, but if he's able to return this week, he makes for a strong RB1 play against a Jags defense that has allowed the 4th most PPR points position. If he isn't able to return, I do think Cam Akers then would be a low-end RB2 or a high-end RB3 this week. And then lastly, Jordan Mason versus the Patriots. The usage is definitely there for Jordan Mason as he remains an absolute workhorse, receiving 80% of the snaps, 70% of the rush attempts. However, what really has hurt him so far is a dismal 4% target share. He's effectively is touchdown or bust at this point. This week, the 49ers take on a Patriots defense that has been decent against the run, only allowing the 19th most PPR points per game to the position.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add on here was I was all about the bounce back for James Conner as well, but you already touched on that. So let's go ahead and just keep this thing rolling. Let's move over to our RB2s for the week. Kicking things off with James Cook at 13, followed by Brian Robinson, Josh Jacobs, David Montgomery, Travis Etienne, Najee Harris, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, Carson Steele making his debut in our top 24, Chuba Hubbard, Tony Pollard, and Jerome Ford rounding things out at RB24. Kev, same thing. What do you like here in the RB2 land? What do you want to talk about?
First, I want to hit on Brian Robinson. He's been a very useful running back this season, averaging 14.4 PPR points per game. He's also been rather efficient with his touches, coming in at 24th in missed tackles forced per attempt and 12th in yards after contact per attempt. This week, the Commanders take on a Cardinals defense that has yielded the 7th most rushing yards, the 11th most receiving yards, and the 10th most PPR points per game. It's also worth noting that Austin Eckler left with what was described as a head injury. If he's forced to miss time, Robinson will be a bell cow. I could see more work in the passing game as well. He is a borderline RB1 for me this week. And then we have Derrick Henry versus Buffalo. While the Bills have actually been a good defense to target with running backs, they have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to the position. I worry more about game script here. If the Ravens can build a lead, Henry should be able to have a solid day, much like he did last week against the Cowboys. However, if they fall behind to one of the hottest offenses in the league, I do have concerns. He's in a smaller workload. He's a high-end RB2 this week for me. Many people are going to have him as an RB1. Next up, let's talk about Najee Harris versus Indy. Early reports from Pittsburgh on Sunday indicated that Najee left the stadium with his right arm in a sling. However, it was revealed that he should be fine and is likely to miss any time. The Steelers take on a Colts defense that has allowed the most rushing yards on the season, but have only allowed one rushing touchdown so far, which is why they have allowed the 16th most PPR points to position. This game should be grossed only a 39.5-point total, meaning that there should be plenty of opportunities for Najee this week, especially with Jalen Warren suffering a knee injury and probably misses this week. Cordell Patterson will be another name people will look at. I think he's a possible flex option for people, but I still think Najee Harris is the guy you want to play. Keep it moving. Let's talk about Josh Jacobs. Jacobs has arguably been awful so far through 3 games. He has yet to produce a top 20 finish and has only seen 4 targets all year. He's currently the RB30 in fantasy points per game. His lack of pass catching use is the part that worries me the most. Despite running 45% of the routes, he's only seeing a 6% target share right now. Also, Jacobs has been an absolute workhorse prior to coming to Green Bay, but this season he's only seeing 63% of the snaps and 55% of the rush attempts. If his usage in the passing game doesn't come up, he's going to be extremely boom or bust. Expected fantasy points per game is significantly better, according to a 15 fantasy points per game compared to the actual 10.8 fantasy points per game he's put up. Now, this week likely won't be much better as the Vikings defense has only allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to position. So I'm really not a big fan of Josh Jacobs this week. Emmanuel Wilson's also kind of working in and taking pass catching work from him. So this is kind of what we were worried about, but it was more so for Marshawn Lloyd and not, Emmanuel Wilson. But that being said, Josh Jacobs is not the guy that we thought he was going to be. At least he hasn't been so through 3 games. We'll see if he's able to bounce back, but this isn't a great spot for him to do it. And then Carson Steele, while it was only 1 week, but there shouldn't be much doubt as Carson Steele is the workhorse in the backfield. He handled 64% of the snaps, 51% of the rush attempts, and ran 42% of the routes, compared to P. Ryan, who played 36% of the snaps, 18% of the rush attempts, and ranked 26th in yards per route run and handled 26% of the routes. This week sets up a really positive game script for Steele and the Chiefs traveling to LA to take on the Chargers. Now, the Chargers likely are going to be without Justin Herbert, making him a really strong RB2 play this week. I know there was reports today that Kareem Hunt was elevated to the 53-man roster, and people are going to get really excited about that. It doesn't change my mind at all whatsoever with Carson Steele. I think Carson Steele remains the RB1 within this backfield, and then you're going to see Samaje Perine, Kareem Hunt mix in, and some pass catching usage and stuff like that. But this is still, right now, I think Carson Steele's opportunity, and he actually played pretty well. I think he had 70 yards on the 16 carries that he saw. So Carson Steele, I think, is a pretty good RB2 play this week. Next up is Devin Singletary. Singletary has been a solid RB2 so far through 3 games, averaging nearly 15 fantasy points per game. He's been relatively solid on a per-touch basis as well, as he is 12th in missed tackles forced per attempt and 6th in yards after contact per attempt. Overall, he's played 72% of the snaps, handled 57% of the rush attempts, making him a decent RB2/flex option almost every single week. Now, this week, Singletary gets what is right now the best matchup for any running back against a Cowboys defense that has allowed the most PPR points to position. They've also allowed the 4th most rushing yards and the most rushing touchdowns and the 4th most receiving yards to running back. So Devin Singletary is somebody I definitely really like this week. I actually thought about putting him much higher, but I feel comfortable with where he's going right now. And then Chuba Hubbard, lastly, is the last guy I want to talk about for Cincinnati after a slow start to the season. Hubbard exploded last week for 21 carries and 5 receptions for 169 yards and a score for nearly 28 fantasy points. He's also seen 10 targets in each of the last 2 weeks after receiving 0 in week 1. This week, the Panthers will look to keep it going as they take on a reeling Bengals team. The Bengals have allowed the 9th most rushing yards and the 5th most rushing touchdowns so far. Hubbard makes for a decent low-end RB2 flex play as well this week.
Yeah, those were all guys that I was keying in on as well. The only other thing I'll add in here for the RB2s is I think the Detroit running backs are set up in a decent way. I think the Seahawks overall fantasy points allowed on some of their stats on the ground are a bit inflated, considering week 1 they played Bo Nix and the Bengals, and last week they went up against Skylar Thompson's Dolphins. But sandwiched in between that, week 2, Ramondre Stevenson went for 81 yards on the ground and a score, and Antonio Gibson had a bit of a revival, going for 96 yards on just 11 carries. So I think you can look to both of them, despite you might see that red next to Monty and Gibbs. I would not be pushed off of that whatsoever in that matchup. And I also think this could be a bit of a bounce back game for Tony Pollard. Kev, we were both commiserating on Sunday night that we had too much Tony Pollard in our DFS lineups. This could be a spot where he bounces back. This should be a similar spot to what he was in last week whenever they played the Packers. They're obviously at Miami this week. So you would think this would set up for a good spot for Tony Pollard. But if anything like last week happens, that will not be the case. Kev, was there anybody beyond the top 24 that you wanted to hit on?
Yeah, the first thing I want to talk about, I know people are going to look at this and wonder where Rachaad White is. And right now we have him as an RB3. Rachaad White has been awful once again on the ground. He's averaging 1.9 true yards per carry, which is 60th among all running backs. However, he has continued to shine as a pass catcher. He has a 16% target share and he's first in route participation. He also ranks ninth in yards per route run. But his value really comes to the air right now. As long as he maintains that role, he should be useful in most weeks. However, I wouldn't be shocked if he continued to lose touches to Bucky Irving, who's just been far more efficient on the ground. He's averaging 4.8 true yards per carry. He's 11th in yards after contact and 14th in missed tackles forced per attempt. Irving, to me, I think is entering a flex play option, and he's had 70 plus yards on the ground in two of his last three games as well, to go along with 6 targets. So while I think Rachaad White is certainly playable, you draft him, you're probably playing him. I just don't necessarily love him because he just hasn't shown anything on the ground. And if he loses that work and he loses that role, like that's what made him so appealing last year. Wasn't just the pass catching work that he saw, was also he just received all of the carries from the backfield. And if that goes away, Rachaad White becomes just more of a flex option than he is anything else. So that's kind of why we have him where we have him. Hopefully he can bounce back and maybe he can get things going. But still, Bucky Irving looks like he might be the guy that takes this role from him, at least the early down work. So next up, I think it's J.K. Dobbins. I wanted to mention him. I really hate this matchup. The Chiefs have actually been really good against running backs this year. They are actually allowed the third fewest PPR points in position, and they've done a pretty good job of shutting down running backs like Derrick Henry and Bijan Robinson so far. And so I don't love this matchup. But if this team's going to be without Justin Herbert, I don't really see how they move the ball. And I mean, this could be a game where the Chiefs just kind of put him out early, and J.K. Dobbins just really gets the touches. So I don't really love J.K. Dobbins this week. Next up is Braelon Allen. Now, Braelon Allen continues to really impress. I mean, I didn't really think he was going to see this type of workload, but you kind of feel like now that the genie's out of the bottle per se, that it's going to be hard to put it back in. Not that I think he's going to take over the backfield or anything like that, but I think he's going to continue to be a running back who sees 8 to 12 touches per game, depending on game script, depending on if that workload is there. And if it's going to be, then I think Braelon Allen does make some sense for as a flex option. And honestly, with how poorly the wide receivers have performed this year, like I'm starting to get more and more where I would rather plug in a running back in my flex than I would a wide receiver at this point, because a lot of the low hanging fruit wide receivers, like guys who are your wide receiver 4s, wide receiver 5s, aren't really producing on the same level as some of these running backs are. So and just say you can go the same route with someone like Roschon Johnson, who took over last week, had 12 touches, looked like the best running back in the backfield there in Chicago. I definitely think he's worth a look this week. I don't mind the matchup either for him. And DeAndre Swift has been absolutely dreadful on the ground. And again, it's kind of being looked like he could be pushed aside here. And, they elevated him, put Travis Homer on IR, kind of opening up this spot for Roschon Johnson. So, and, he's the guy that really handled most of the touches for this team last week. And I don't know if that really goes away. So Roschon Johnson, I definitely think is another option you can look at as flex. And then lastly, in this game for the Baltimore Ravens this week against the Buffalo Bills, this feels more like a game script that's going to set up nicely for Justice Hill. So I do think Justice Hill in PPR formats is somebody that we can take a look at here to probably plug in this week as a decent option. And then lastly, I do think Rico Dowdle is also in play. I think Zeke's dust. I mean, he looks like dust. I think so. For me, I think Rico Dowdle might be another option here you could look at as a flex.
I know you kind of mentioned in passing, but I just want to throw out again, assuming that Jalen Warren is going to miss this one, Cordell Patterson, for anyone who is desperate for a flex type play, I think you can look at him. And then the last one, some of the gross matchups that you were mentioning, I'm completely on board with everything you were talking about. Chase Brown is a running back that I would play over all of those guys that you were mentioning you were down on. So those are some plays for you guys for this week. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. You can also join our free Discord. You can also join us on Wednesday night. We're going to be going live to go through our first edition of the Start Sit Show. If that's not enough for you, we will be live again on Sunday morning for another edition of Start Sit. So plenty of time, plenty of opportunities to get your questions answered. Good luck this week. Make sure you hit that like and that sub, and we'll talk to you all soon.